For a period of around 6 months, an all-party parliamentary inquiry has been held looking into the current state of the UK or British wrestling scene. I have not actually had the opportunity as of yet to sit down, properly read and study this final report, which was only released a couple of days ago. That is why this video is a look at the summary on that inquiry. You can find the inquiry at this following website. I will put a link in the description below: www.appgwrestling.uk. That is the website. That is where you can find the summary, which I will be talking about in this video, and there's also a link to read and or download the full 103 page report. Obviously, like I've just said, I am discussing the summary on this video. A couple of reasons for that, and I know that not having read the full report, some people will scoff at that, some people will have their own comment or opinion, but the reason why I'm only making a video talking about the summary is not only because I haven't had the opportunity to sit and read the whole report. I am a UK wrestling fan who wants the industry, and I've attended live shows for many years. I want the industry to not only survive but thrive and be a lot better going forward. But also, I'll be honest, I'm just a wrestling fan. I have not been and am not involved in any wrestling promotion. I have not been involved in the putting on or running of any wrestling show, and so I certainly do not feel like I am qualified to talk about the report in depth. I am not one of those people who, and I encourage everyone to go onto that website and to read and or download the report, to read at your leisure and study it, and hopefully take whatever positives there are in this report forward. But I certainly feel that I am not really properly qualified to talk about the report in full. Which I really encourage people, especially those who are involved in putting on shows, whether you have been on in the past or whether you're a wrestler or ring crew or whatever position you are, if you're involved in the British wrestling industry, and certainly in terms of the shows, I would encourage you to go and read of it. And obviously, again, with everything I say about the various topics that I cover, people are always welcome to go look at this stuff, make up their own opinions whether this report is worth anything or not, and whether anything will happen because of this going forward. The summary page is the first page you will come to when you go to that website, if you're interested in doing so. It does give a link at the top of the page to the full report. Again, you can read and or download it if you so wish. I am going to look through the main recommendations that is on that page, and there's also a couple of comments from 4 MPs that have been a part of the inquiry. I'll read those shortly. I'll just give you the quick kind of summary about the inquiry first before I get to the main recommendations. It says that all party parliamentary groups, or APPGs, are formed by members of both houses of parliament from across the political spectrum and meet to discuss issues of concern. Unlike select committees, APPGs are voluntary and receive no parliamentary funding, but do have access to parliamentary facilities. The groups have no formal place in the legislature. This is the kind of relevant part. The cross-party inquiry panel of the all-party parliamentary inquiry into professional wrestling in Great Britain, led by all-party parliamentary group on wrestling, co-chairs Alex Davies-Jones MP and Mark Fletcher MP, has taken written and oral evidence on the professional wrestling industry from some 80 wrestlers, promoters, ring crew, training school operators, academics, healthcare professionals, and others connected to the British wrestling world. The report marks the first time that this unregulated industry, which crosses the threshold between sport and theatre, has been analysed in a systematic way by parliamentarians, and the first official intervention in nearly 80 years. I believe basically, I'm not going to go into all that, but basically I believe that there was kind of a public call, or a kind of almost like a casting call thing of, right, anybody interested in providing evidence, get in contact with us. I believe that's where a lot of their evidence came from, people coming forward to give their evidence. How widespread it is, I don't know. I think I said, recording the first intro, Betty, that a lot, certainly, the exact evidence from who and what is being kept anonymously, so they can't, people, I don't think it's probably just so that, somebody can say, well, Barry said this, and then Alan said this, and Steve said this, and such. So there's kind of no comebacks, or I don't know, but certainly from the replies I'm seeing on Twitter, especially, that's what's happening. So get to finally get to the main recommendations. Now, there are a few of these main recommendations that have been highlighted on the summary page. There is in total 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 6 or 7 in total. I'll read them, each one of them individually, and then I will give my quick opinion on them. Right, so the main recommendations. Wrestling has fallen between the categories of sport and theatre, sometimes characterised as sports entertainment. The panel recommends that wrestling training schools should be considered as sporting, and shows, promotions and associated activity be considered theatrical or artistic or performative in respect of future guidance, legislation and regulation. Now, again, that is not my area of expertise, but I certainly would say that is trying again to define, pro wrestling, and especially an American kind of, I believe like the WWE, they've kind of been the ones to really embrace, especially WWE, this term of sports entertainment. And what professional wrestling actually is has been a manner of great debate for many, many decades now. And so what this initially looks like, they are trying to divide wrestling into, kind of identify where wrestling meets the sports category and meets the performance category, and obviously different areas. There is something coming up about the sports which I kind of agree with, and I'll read that in a moment. I don't know how that will affect legislation and things like insurance and what procedures and things that promotions have to put in place, but I think hopefully this will look to recognise the uniqueness of pro wrestling, of the different areas of the industry, because it is, again, it is performance art, but it's also kind of sport and performance, really it is, I suppose. So they're looking at trying to identify basically the sports entertainment, where sports come into it, where entertainment comes with. They want that to be further and kind of fully defined. This is the part about sporting which I kind of stopped myself from talking about. This next main recommendation: the minimum health and safety standards across independent wrestling in Britain is worryingly low. The parliamentarians have recommended a raft of measures, most notably enhanced requirements under the licensing and insurance arrangements wrestling companies have in place, and the adoption of concussion protocols, signed PAR-Q fitness forms, guidance from the Health and Safety Executive, and minimum first aid training are also recommended. Again, that's where the sports in professional wrestling, which is what I completely agree with. Obviously, I've always said pro wrestling, it is kind of a bit of a performance art, but the physicality of it, the dangers of it, even in training, there is always the risk of injury and accidents. There is always that. So to have the proper procedures in place to try and safeguard those participants, even whether they're an experienced wrestler or not, to have that, like, if an incident happens, if someone gets injured, to have, and depending on that injury, to have correct protocols in place to deal with that injury, whether to have like said first aid training, so that there is always somebody present, so that can actually immediately interject themselves if somebody gets hurt. It's kind of like what we have, and I'll be honest, for those not really known wrestling who may have come across this video, this is kind of something that's been building up lately within professional wrestling, within local councils, especially like here in Tayside and across Scotland. There has been the kind of, especially the last couple, pre-COVID, the last couple of years, there's been a build-up of basically local councils, especially Edinburgh, here in Dundee and Tayside, about councils saying that there must be, for instance, a paramedic on site for shows. There must be, ambulance crew there. Obviously the company must have the proper insurances in place before shows can happen. There's been something that's been building up, certainly in Scotland. I cannot talk about England and about their council regulations, but certainly here in Scotland, this has been something that has been being put forward for the last couple of years, that there must be X amount of people that have at least first aid training. Like I said, that they must have ambulance or paramedics present at shows. Obviously there's been some concern about that, because the companies themselves are expected to pay for that. So it doesn't come, that money doesn't come from the council. The company have to pay for that themselves out of their revenue. So that's been something I've discussed, and there's been various different licensing and insurance complications as well, which I'm not going to talk about, because we kind of were led a little bit astray, I'll be honest. But from what we were told by certain people, which I'm not going to go into, but we were kind of led astray and told different things which I believe not to be true these days. But in terms of the paramedics, ambulance present for shows, in case of any incident, it's like pretty much like any other like football matches. My uncle worked in the Scottish Ambulance Service for the majority of his life, and part of the reason why he got into being involved with one of the local football clubs is because he was part of, for many years, part of providing that ambulance coverage for the football matches. So things like that, I completely highly recommend. Not every single training session have paramedics and ambulance. Obviously there's obviously the emergency numbers if needed, but certainly to have people that are trained in first aid, who have some kind of training to deal with injuries, or at least give first aid, it sounds like an exceptional idea to me. It sounds like one of the things, because as it says in the intro of the summary, the industry is quite unregulated. Now this is, the next recommendation to me is also, I'll be honest, something that's been talked about this past year, and I'm not going to go into it in depth. This is the next main recommendation. Wrestling's own Me Too movement, known as Speaking Out, highlighted stories of abuse, assault and predation. The report makes a number of recommendations in response to the movement, including hardwiring the voice of abuse survivors into British wrestling, the development of practical guides for first responders, and working to establish case management systems to address allegations of abuse. Again, that is something that's been talked about for this past almost year plus. It's kind of gone hand in hand slightly along with this COVID lockdown situation, that people have finally had the bravery, the opportunity, I believe, really to speak out. And this is one of the things that has really dogged British wrestling for many years, even going back like to the 80s, the 90s. There have been stories and people that have been known about in the wrestling industry that basically take advantage of trainees. Some of the stories that we have heard over this past year have been horrific, have been completely unacceptable, concerning, and let's be honest, in any other form of business, sports, or anything like that, I think the police would be involved very heavily. Action would possibly, because hopefully with evidence, action would be taken against those perpetrators. And obviously in those situations, it's that is one of the most difficult. I'm not going to go into that because I don't have the experience, the knowledge, the expertise to talk about it, but it's always been talked about that getting action, legal action against some perpetrators is an extremely difficult thing to do. It is absolutely something that British wrestling, as I said, has been dogged with and has been troubled with for many, many years, and it is certainly one of the kind of the change that British wrestling can actually really afford to finally cut and move forward, hopefully with anybody that is not of good character being pushed out of the British wrestling scene permanently. The next main recommendation actually comes along on a similar line. Wrestling training schools have insufficient protection in place, particularly given they are regularly working with minors. Many training schools, especially these days, are actually offering what is called junior classes, classes of those who are not old enough kind of to train properly, but some training schools are offering what's basically child fitness classes, or those who maybe be young, maybe into wrestling. So talking maybe like, I think some of them are like 8 from like age 8 or so onwards. It's basically kind of child fitness classes, but if they're wrestling fans, they get to do it in the ring, kind of in a bit, obviously in a very supervised way. The report recommends that, as is proposed under current legislation, sports coaches be recognised as a position of trust for the purposes of child offences, and that wrestling coaches can be considered sports coaches for this purpose. A number of interim steps in relation to safeguarding and data protection are also proposed. Again, just holding those coaching in more of a position of responsibility, of holding them to that responsibility, even defining them as, again, they are, which is what they are. They are in a position of trust. They are and should be able to know that they, whether it be minors or young trainees, if they are the adults in charge, especially, they should be held to very tightly determined and defined laws. It's just like any other, like you would, like handing over your children to a babysitter. They, you trust them to look after your child properly. The same should always go in terms of wrestling and wrestling coaches. I don't know whether parents, etc., are there at the training sessions. Some I believe probably like some of the child sports, some will be, some aren't, some just for not there, just simply for the space, because that's the thing, many wrestling promotions, training schools, they work in smaller kind of gym halls, etc., that they hire out or they rent. So yeah, again, that's one of the kind of common sense things I think from this summary, is to hold coaches to this defined position of trust. The next main recommendation: the wrestling industry suffers from a lack of official representation, and the report recommends the establishment of trade bodies to effectively promote British wrestling. Again, British wrestling is still, wrestling is not as popular as it once was. We do get it in waves of people, like for instance in the 1990s, pro wrestling was extremely popular with the likes of the Attitude Era, the American wrestling. I've talked about it before, the American wrestling organisations, after the British wrestling scene was taken off ITV, and basically the scene kind of basically disappeared. And then the late 80s, early 90s, the American companies came over, and so it's extremely difficult in wrestling, because again, just because of how wrestling is, what wrestling is actually, the popularity will come in waves and come and go. But the honest truth is, in the promotion of, it's slightly different now with social media, with the internet, with things like YouTube, Facebook, all of those kind of things. There is a lot of ways for companies to promote shows, but there is still, unfortunately, a reliance on literally putting up posters, the way that it's been for many decades. One of the major reliances of trying to get people to the shows is physically putting up posters in the area or the city where the show is taking place. Now, I don't think they mean that kind of promotion exactly, but I think that will go into it, and to promote and encourage the right standards and practices within British wrestling. I think that's what they mean more as well, but I think that goes into this recommendation. Again, I haven't read the full report, but certainly things like that to effectively promote and encourage the British wrestling scene. The next one is other recommendations include a call for increased data collection about the industry, appropriate memorialisation of great British wrestling talents, building on the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame for Scotland, work to better understand the gender pay gap in wrestling, infrastructure to support wrestlers working overseas, and better measures to accommodate visiting talent, and creating a safety standard for wrestling rings. There's a whole lot to unpack in that just those brief few sentences. Definitely, one of the things that I think British wrestling is quite decent at is recognising, it depends on the area and depends on the people, but to recognise and respect the history of British wrestling, one of the kind of older, I think, pro wrestling industries across the world, which has had, of course, a tremendous, I'll talk about that, tremendous influence around the world. I'll give my quick opinions at the end of this, but there is a little bit of good recognition, but there's no, it's much, that's the thing about pro wrestling. There is a lot of, there's things like the WWE Hall of Fame, which You know, a lot of people scoff at so many of these Hall of Fames, but there isn't really a centralised kind of, at least not in my opinion, there's not a kind of centralised or kind of local, well, this, you know, a kind of collection of the history of pro wrestling. And I know there are probably people who work extremely hard on that, but, you know, in general, there is not like a great resource where we go, right, well, let's recognise and let's honour those who have come before us, even if it's from many decades ago, even if they passed on a long time ago. There's also the gender pay gap in wrestling. To be honest, I again, that's another very complicated issue, which I think if you work a match on a show, you should be paid. And again, it's a very complicated thing because of the champions, and there's always been especially if you're a heavyweight, if you're a company champion, then you're seen like a WWE World Heavyweight Champion or that. If you're the company's champion, then part of pro wrestling is that you're partly responsible for the amount of people that is attracted to the shows. If business is up, it's your response. It's it's because people want to pay money to see the champion, but if business is down, that's your responsibility. It is so complicated. Again, out with kind of my qualified understanding of wrestling, in terms of the inner workings of it. But yeah, I think if you do a show in wrestling, you should be paid for it, not not told, oh, you're doing this for exposure, or I'll give you a hot dog, which is another old kind of typical thing, or whichever. If you're working a match on the show, there should be basically a base pay of at least. Again, it's very difficult with UK independent wrestling to judge it, but certainly if you're two females doing a singles match, then you should be paid the same basically as two males doing a singles match on the same show. In terms of wrestling rings, yes, there is no real standard for wrestling rings in the UK. They are steel canvas board, wooden boards, canvas covered wooden boards on steel. It would be very great to have a standard for wrestling rings. One of the major complaints, I guess it is a complaint, from a lot of independent wrestlers, guys like Colt Cabana, who's a major name in the world of professional wrestling, who has great love for UK wrestling and has wrestled in the UK for many years, off and on. He said it before, and many other independent wrestlers have said it. You have to always check out the ring when you get to a show, if you can, before you wrestle, because there is, although generally you know what to expect, 3 ring ropes, 4 posts, and as I said, wooden boards on steel, there is always quite a difference between wrestling rings. And again, I'm not qualified to sit here and talk about what makes a good ring, what makes a bad ring, what makes a medium quality ring in professional wrestling. But to have a ring or have a standard where any wrestler can travel from Sheffield to Aberdeen to Glasgow, Edinburgh, and be completely confident that they are stepping in a ring which, if whatever moves and holds that they do, if they want to take bumps in that ring, then it is completely safe to do so. So those are the main recommendations that are on the summary page. I know this video is very, very long. I do feel I want to read the remarks of the MPs, but looking at those, these are obviously quite a few recommendations. Again, I have not had the opportunity to read and fully study this report. It has just come out a couple of days ago. Again, www.appgwrestling.uk. Link is in the description. I will make sure I do that. So more people better qualified than me can read through it, look at, okay, understand that this is doable, that is not doable. And they will, and it's obviously the ones who are in the industry, who do put on shows, who do have the knowledge and the experience, that will be able to look at this report in depth and say, yes, that works, no, that doesn't work. Because you always get that with people saying, well, can't you do it? With every industry, with every business, you always have outsiders. And even though the some of these MPs have apparently said that they are wrestling fans, there's always outsiders that will come along and tell any business, any industry, you should not be doing this, you should be doing that. And some may be suggestions for improvements, and other ideas may be not possible. It may just be just the way that industry works, or the better standards and practices of that industry. For instance, in wrestling, limiting 2 people to a wrestling ring, that would not work. You've got tag and team matches, multi-person matches even. To limit, become singles only would not work in wrestling. So just kind of ideas like that. There are always people that have their own ideas and suggestions, some of which may be good, again, some may not work. So before I give my quick thoughts, because I know this is extremely, again, long video, the co-chairs Alex Davies-Jones, MP, and Mark Fletcher, MP, quoted as saying, "We are delighted to take what we hope will be a first step towards strengthening and improving the wrestling industry, which brings joy to so many people, ourselves included. We don't do reports that sit on a shelf and look forward to putting our recommendations into action in the coming weeks." Sports Minister Nigel Huddleston, MP, said, "The government welcomes the APPG's report and will be carefully considering its findings. We want to see a successful wrestling industry for its participants and many fans right across the country." The final quote comes from Shadow Minister Alison McGovern, MP, who says, "This is a detailed report covering both the performance and sporting aspect of wrestling that many love dearly, but which have also long-standing issues that need attention. The APPG have done a great piece of work here, and I hope DCMS will look at it closely." So that is basically the summary and the remarks made. Again, it is I've gone a little bit more in depth than I wanted to, but a lot of people are obviously looking at this inquiry, and although it's an informal inquiry, it doesn't hold too much official weight. Many people are already looking at this and commenting on social media, especially Twitter, in the hopes that this is the start, this is the first steps towards, as I said, the standardisation of standards and practices across the British wrestling scene. A lot of people want to see improvements, especially with everything that's happened this past year or so with the speaking out movement, aka wrestling's Me Too movement, with what has been basically, as this summary says, a basically unregulated industry for the last 80 years. And it's amazing that it's been allowed to go on that long, because let's be honest, practically anybody could set up a wrestling show. And we've seen it before. Somebody comes along that for however reason and whatever reason and however they've got what seems to be a ton of money behind them, some great financial resources, it seems anyway, and they're able to immediately throw a lot of money into it, into some project, maybe even get a show on TV, and not really, it doesn't work. And that's something that's never worked in British wrestling. Just somebody coming along throwing a lot of money and set up a wrestling company has never worked in the UK, and I don't think it ever will. But people now, I'm not saying that that anybody that does that could be dodgy. That could very well be the case, but it is true that anybody could really put on wrestling shows. And there's a little bit more with insurance now, and again, like I said earlier about councils, especially in Scotland and like Edinburgh and Tayside, talking about having paramedics or ambulance crew at ringside for shows. But anybody can basically run a wrestling company these days. You can set up one here in Dundee and be the idiot that you want to be and run shows if you want, and you can kind of get away with that to a degree. But certainly a more stricter control of the British wrestling scene, I think, it looks initially, reading this report, and some people will say it is a bit of lip service. Again, I don't know going forward how much of this stuff will actually be put in place and how much of it will be driven forward when wrestling returns, as we get, hopefully, later in 2022 towards the end. I know a few promotions have their eye on returning and putting on shows. Hopefully those people, I think, to be honest, regardless of government, regardless of ministers, regardless of MPs, MSPs, Welsh ministers, whatever, I really kind of hope that people involved in the British wrestling industry take a look at the summary and obviously the report itself and genuinely take on board some of the recommendations and advice that this report and just basically common sense dictates. And again, I've not read the whole report, I am studied it in depth, but some of those things just in the summary look quite a lot of common sense. And I know this will put some, again, financial strain on some promotions. It will hopefully, in some promotions, change the way that they've been doing it. Some promotions do need to wake up and smell the coffee as it is, or and before they can wake up and smell the roses, they need to actually have a great look in depth at how they're running their own promotion, what they're actually doing right, and obviously what they're doing wrong. Like I said, it's up to better qualified people than myself, people who have been or are involved in running and putting on wrestling shows, that will be able to judge whether this report is worth anything, whether any recommendations in this report are worth carrying forward and implementing, even individually, even if no such trade body or regulation body comes forward and starts to regulate wrestling as a whole in the UK. Hopefully some promotions, some trainers, some promotions and training schools will look at these recommendations, will look at what's happened within wrestling over this long history, and decide that this is finally the time to take a better step forward in behaviour standards and practices. Again, just even within their promotion, if they can't encourage others to do and make those proper moves, then hopefully at least they can do it themselves in their own promotion, and maybe that'll catch the attention of others and encourage others to do so. Like I said, I'm not properly qualified to really talk about that kind of thing in depth, but yeah, as I said, I am a wrestling fan. I have been to many live shows over the years, continue to do it once the shows come back, hopefully like November-ish time at least, when proper shows start again. But yeah, I absolutely would love to see a great improvement in the British wrestling scene. Let's be honest, before I end this, British wrestling has been so influential right across the world for many, many decades. You've got major superstars in WWE, some of the training staff in likes of WWE and across the world have been either influenced by or are former members of the UK wrestling scene. And I think as much as British wrestling is admired for its talents, the talented wrestlers, British wrestling is admired for the talents that it has provided the world, and of course the in-ring skills that it tends to instill in its performers. I think it would be a fantastic idea if British wrestling going into the future would be also admired for the handling of the industry, the way the industry is set up. It should hopefully be something that we look towards doing, is that when people look at the British wrestling scene, say that industry, that's UK wrestling scene, that's what I want to work for, because of the standards in that industry in the UK are a very high level. Everything about the UK scene says professionalism. That's something I hope that we aim for in the future, but absolutely it's up to everybody in the UK wrestling scene. Do I fear that this might just be a flash in the pan, and after a while this will just settle down, people will go back to their old ways? Of course I do, but hopefully there are decent people and sensible people in the British wrestling scene that takes this stuff on board.